The annual Champagne Masters is always a huge highlight of the tasting year. In terms of this year, the 2025 edition, I would say, well, a couple of things occur to me. The first one is that the top wines, in other words, the vintages and the prestige cuvées, they have stood out head and shoulders above the, if you like, the normal non-vintage wines. And yes, in a normal edition of the Champagne Masters, there's always a progression, but to me this year, the distinction between the normal non-vintage wines and those vintage and prestige cuvée wines was really extraordinary. If you said why, I think maybe it's we've had a run of some very good vintages. Maybe it's that wine producers are, as they always perhaps should have done, selecting their very finest wines to go into the vintage and the prestige cuvées. But that certainly struck me this year.
So I feel that I'm in a really privileged position now because I've just tasted almost 100 champagnes, taking in all categories and featuring the latest releases in the market. And I say I feel I'm in a privileged position because I have a handle on what is the current trends, stylistic trends concerning champagne at the moment. And for me, there have been a few things that have stood out. One is that the quality of brut non-vintage champagne being made today is really at a peak. These wines are instantly appealing, they're complex, they're refreshing, they're ripe, they're generous, they're pleasurable. They make great aperitifs, but they could also pair very well with food. The downside is that I am noticing that these wines that are undoubtedly great, that are really at the top of the traditional method sparkling wine pyramid, are also now very expensive. We're talking at entry point prices of brut non-vintage of above £50. A few years ago, those would have been 30 to 50, they're now 50 to 70. I think that's tough for what is a cash-strapped consumer, but undoubtedly they are great.
For me, the tasting today really highlighted the differences in some areas. And I know that different groups got different wines, so this is speaking very specifically about my panel. The rosés were disappointing. Rosé champagne for me should be fun and enjoyable. It's not always the most complex champagne, but there should be joy in it. And I wasn't finding much of that. But then we got to the vintage champagnes and the prestige cuvées, and suddenly there was joy and excitement and those glasses that jump out at you and make you go, what is this? I want to know because I want to taste this again.
The other category that seems to show very well with my team was the Blanc de Blanc. So they did very, very well. Whereas on the downside, and this is where producers need to I think, perk up and get their act together, is rosé. And this is something that I've bellyached before, but the quality of the rosés, there were some good ones, but the general standard of rosé was not great, and consumers are paying a lot of money for these wines. So, if I could wave my finger at the champagne industry and say, an area you need to do some work on is rosé. And it's true of all rosé wines that although it's a style we associate with fun and drinking for relaxation and it's informal, that doesn't mean it's an easy style to make. And I think, I'm afraid, not just in Champagne, but around the world, there's this idea that, yes, rosé is a relaxed, fun, informal drink. But that, from a production angle, doesn't mean it's easy. And I think a lot of winemakers are not focusing enough on quality when it comes to rosé.
A few other things I've discovered today, now I've seen what I have tasted. There's some really great vintage champagnes coming onto the market. That, for me, is the sweet spot in champagne for quality versus price. They are expensive, but for maybe £15-20 more than a brut non-vintage, you get something that is truly outstanding. 2018 vintages looking very good. Some of the older expressions, 2012, are excellent. A real highlight for me today was finding an outstanding 2003. It was made by Mert and Chandon. It's a late release vintage, but 2003 was a vintage that was dismissed at the time by a lot of commentators because they felt, because it was a heat wave harvest, that the wines were too ripe, they lacked acidity and wouldn't age and keep. We are tasting a wine now today that is more than 20 years old, that is fantastic. It's in amazing condition, toasty, creamy coffee characters, slightly caramelized, but still refreshing, and just such a complex and delicious wine. I think it may have been my highest scoring wine of today. I would like to say, after today's tasting, a lot of talk about climate change and how it's affecting the style of champagne. I think there's a feeling that maybe producers are seeing lower acidity levels in the fruit, and they might be tempted not to put the wines through malolactic fermentation, that being the conversion of hard-tasting malic acid to softer lactic forms. My experience of today's tasting was actually the wines that performed least well were those where they hadn't put the wines through the malolactic fermentation. It meant the champagnes had quite a biting, hard, acid finish. I think champagne should be soft and pleasurable. Those wines, for me, failed on that front. What I did notice, on the other hand, was that because there are riper fruit characters coming through in champagnes, even at the lower levels, a lower dosage is now favoured. And I actually found that some of the higher scoring wines of today were extra brutes, even brut nature, so no added sugar whatsoever to the champagne. A few years ago, those wines, I fear, would have been biting and austere. Today they are delicious and balanced.